and gentlemen, this war in Ukraine really has people in their feelings, especially that, Trump is trolling Zelensky right now, calling him names, and is trying to find a way to end the war in Ukraine, which is what polls are showing. The majority of Americans are not looking at the Ukraine war in a favorable way anymore when you compare it to 2022. So when you see these conversations, just keep that in mind, that there are still some people who are still trying to find a reason to keep this war going. And Glenn Greenwald had to debate someone who was trying to do that. And that's Dan Crenshaw. Dan Crenshaw, he's the gentleman with the eye patch, very much feels that the U.S. government should not abandon Ukraine. Let's get into this conversation here. I thought this was really interesting. A panel here on Piers Morgan's show, and I think Glenn did a good job. There's one thing I want to add that Glenn didn't mention that I will add to this. Listen.
The panel now. Glenn Greenwald, great to have you back on Uncensored. What do you make of this? I mean, Trump, at the very least, what he's done is immediately reestablish diplomatic ties with Russia. Do you think that's a good move?
I actually do think it's good for the two countries with the world's largest nuclear stockpiles that have come close to nuclear Armageddon in the past to actually speak to one another. I think one of the worst parts of the last decade in Washington, the Russiagate hoax and all of that, was that it created a climate where it was almost criminal for American officials to speak to Russians. Even during the Cold War, when we viewed each other as existential threats, we had all sorts of open communication. The Russians would come to the United States. We would hear from their leaders. Our leaders would go over there and speak. Of course, these kinds of communications are vital. Trump deserves a lot of credit for opening that up. It's dangerous to the world when the Russians and the Americans don't speak. And I think we have to begin with, since we all love democracy here so much, we're all so eager to advance it around the world in between arming and propping up the Saudis and Egyptians. But in general, we're good people. We love democracy. We just had an election in 2024 in which the winning candidate, Donald Trump, went around saying, not as an ancillary view, but as central to his campaign, it's time that we keep American money in the United States for American citizens. We have to stop funding all of these foreign wars where our country's not at risk, and specifically said he wants to end the war in Ukraine. The Biden-Kamala Harris view, the view of the Democratic Party, was, no, we can't talk to the Russians. We have to fund Ukraine until the very last Ukrainian is dead in order to expel all Russian troops from Ukrainian soil. A complete pipe dream from the start. And Americans voted for the candidate who said he wanted to end U.S. involvement in the war. That should matter if we love democracy so much. Americans, and I think that's what Trump, above everything, whether you disagree with him or agree with him, and I have both, is following through on what he promised he would do in the campaign. And that kind of responsiveness democratically in the United States is very rare to see.
Yeah, I mean,
and there are a number of people, again, who did support Donald Trump because of that reason, right? So there's different reasons why people supported him. And that is one of the reasons why some people did choose to do that. They were like, no, he said he's going to end the Ukraine war. We don't need to send any more money or weapons to Ukraine. That was a big one for some people. So that's a really good one there that Glenn brought up. So that whole America first, ideology and rhetoric that was a part of Donald Trump's campaign. But watch this. This is interesting.
I posted on X yesterday. Let me get this straight. Are the world's liberals now enraged that a Republican president wants to stop two wars? And I don't think I've had a post that's blown up quite like that in a long time. Millions and millions of people interacting with it. Because it is a weird situation where historically, in the last 50, 60 years, the liberal positions have been, can Republican presidents please stop going to war everywhere? Now you've got a Republican president who openly hates war, wants to stop it wherever it starts. And all right, people may not like his tactics at the moment, but he is a negotiator. He often uses blunt, shocking tactics to negotiate. And he's bringing that tool, that skill set to both Ukraine and Israel. But let's talk about Ukraine for the purposes of this. What's your view of it? I mean, are you instinctively, this is an outrage, or do you think it's quite good that a Republican president wants to have peace, not war? Piers Morgan.
Yeah. So then we want to move on to let's go to the Dan Crenshaw part. This guy is really cringe. I see him prop up every now and then. Watch this.
Table, absolutely.
That's what Trump said. I mean, Trump was asked categorically. He clarified. He said, to be clear, when it comes to the actual negotiations over resolving the war, of course, Ukraine will be at the table. What they've had in Saudi is the first time that the Russians and the Americans have got together, and actually Ukraine was one of many things that they talked about. So, you know,
I mean, we talk to Ukraine every single day. We have people there with them every single day.
I just think we should save our fury about whether Ukraine get included or not for when they actually get excluded.
Can I just assert a little bit of realism into the conversation?
Yes.
Because I know Dan started off by saying, "Oh, Russia's this crappy little second-rate power. We have to flatter them and make them think they matter, but they really don't. They're really weak." It's always a pretty weird contradiction to simultaneously say that and then at the same time warn that Russia's going to start invading Western Europe, this crappy little second-rate power. But the reality is, this is the reality whether you like it or not, Russia has fought a war now for 3 years against unified NATO and the United States, pouring hundreds of billions of dollars and highly sophisticated weapons into Ukraine, and the front line continues to move westward, not eastward, where the Russians are gaining more and more territory. More and more Ukrainians are being killed. There are fewer Ukrainian men left in that country who want to fight. They're being forcibly dragged in there and used as cannon fodder, or they're fleeing and risking their lives to do it. The reality is Russia is winning the war or has won the war. And you can say, oh, you must be a Kremlin agent to say that.
You know, you just got to know nothing about military information or tactics.
So here comes Dan Crenshaw, who's like, this guy doesn't know anything. You weren't in the military. I was a part of the military. I know what I'm talking about. But it's obvious to anyone who's been following this war for actually since the beginning. It's very obvious. Ukraine has no chance here. Yes, Russia is winning this war. And I think anyone that's has common sense about the situation can see that very well. There's also the issue of Ukraine running out of soldiers. And you guys have seen these videos where they're pulling people off of the street to get them to go fight. This is absolutely horrendous and insane. And Dan Crenshaw was just like, oh, no, Russia is losing. Are you kidding me? As big as Russia is, have you guys seen Russia? And then you look at Russia and look at Ukraine and think about all the weapons and the power that Russia has. The US government has been giving weapons to Ukraine constantly. And even with all of those weapons, they still can't beat Russia. And the US government and NATO, they knew this. The US government and NATO knew that Ukraine cannot beat Russia. This whole idea is really to create a bigger conflict, to drag us into a World War III. Anything to push Russia out, to stop Russia from having the type of prominence that they have. And after Russia, it would be China, in my prediction. After Russia, they would go after China next. And so they're willing to put all these people at risk for something that they know is not possible. They know they can't win, you know? It's just one of those things.
That's what you have to do to say that. You just have to know nothing.
So the idea that
is clearly what you do.
Yeah, well,
you got so many facts wrong. It's hard to know where to even start.
You can. You think Ukraine is winning the war? In which direction is the front line moved, Dan? Has it moved westward or eastward?
It depends on where you're looking at. It depends on where you're looking at. I hate to break it to you, but it depends on where you're looking at. And the ratios of Russian deaths to Ukrainian deaths is like 4-1. You just don't know what you're talking about.
Tens of thousands
You've never fought anything.
Men. You have no idea what you're talking about.
I
fought a lot of things. I fought a lot of things.
Oh, you fought a lot of things?
Just because you were in the military doesn't make you an expert. I'm sorry to say that Donald Trump
I don't need to be an expert. I just have basic facts and I have all the briefings on it. I don't think you do.
Clearly Russia is winning the war. The Ukrainians don't even want to go and fight this war any longer. They're fleeing the country.
It's a war of attrition with a stalemate. That's what we're looking at right now. That's the most honest way to look at it.
I'm sorry to say, one of the things that I know that you don't actually have to go join the military to understand is that Russia is many, many, many times larger than Ukraine. And that's the reason why the most prescient geopolitical experts, people have been on this show, I've interviewed them many times, people like John Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs and Stephen Wald, all said since 2022, Ukraine will inevitably lose this war and Russia will win it. And I'll tell you why. This is the one point I want to make. When President Obama was on his way out of office in 2016, Jeffrey Goldberg interviewed him for a cover story on the Obama foreign policy doctrine. And he criticized Obama for not standing up to Russia in Syria and in Ukraine. And what Obama said was, the reality is Ukraine is and always has been and always will be a vital interest to Russia because it's right on the other side of their border, and it has never been and never will be a vital interest to the United States. So the idea that we're going to confront Russia or go to war with Russia over who governs various provinces in eastern Ukraine is absolute madness.
All right,
and President Obama was absolutely right, and President Trump thinks that too.
All right, yes. All right.
So let's jump into this part here, right? Because Mr. The Crenshaw dude, right over here, Glenn is getting very upset. Glenn is getting very upset. And so again, obviously Dan Crenshaw, he's a warmonger. Like I said, he wants this war to continue. Some people call him Eye Patch McCain. Like you get the idea. So that's what he wants to happen. Glenn, on the other hand, is thinking about this from a logical perspective. You're not going to beat Russia. So what are we doing? How many people in Ukraine have to die? People say they care about the Ukrainians. How many people in Ukraine have to die? How many? They're pulling people off the street that are in their 40s. So to me, it's a lose-lose situation. But they want to keep it going. Now, the question is, why do they want to keep it going? It's not just to stop Russia, right? It's not just to stage a larger war. You have to get into that question as well. Why do they want a larger war? All of this is good for the military-industrial complex. All of this is good for Raytheon. It's great for Northrop Grumman. Like, that's what this all goes back to. You have to connect the dots. When people make this comment, they used to say this, that war was good for the economy. No, war is good for the military-industrial complex. It's good for those contractors. It's great business for them. So that's really what they're keeping in power here. That's really what they're keeping going. They don't care if people die in Ukraine, just like they didn't care when people died in Vietnam.
Quickly, so
this is not worth dealing with.
Yeah, two things real quick. Going back to the conversation you and Dan were having, I will say this. Right now, Ukrainians, Zelensky and Europe feel like they're left out. That's number one. That's how they feel. What's happening right now with Russia and US. Secondly, I'm not going to be a cheerleader here for Russia and say they're winning a war. Ukrainians, having talked to them, having talked to the people who are resisting, I will tell you this. I will tell the world right now. Ukrainians, to the last man, to the last elder, to the last kid, to the last woman, will fight. They will fight to the end for their independence.
Well, actually, as you said.
No, I'm sorry. There are people, they're dragging people off the street and the people are trying not to go. They're dragging people off the street and pulling them into a van, and the people don't want to go. And they're saying, no, let me go. What are you talking about? Now, this guy here who's speaking, he's very good on Gaza, terrible on this one. And you'll find that with some people. Some people, they're really good on Israel and Gaza. But when you start talking about China, awful. When they start talking about Russia, awful. Great on Gaza, though, but they can't apply those same type of concepts when it comes to other countries. But no, I have not seen that at all. I'm not seeing these people say that they want to go out and fight and all this stuff. These people are begging you not to drag them and pull them into a van and take them away from their family.
Being dragged there. They're being dragged there involuntarily.
Well, hang on, guys. Let me just read. I want to read you some breaking news.
He's sprinkling in Glenn is sprinkling in some truth about the nature of the war with some facts that are just incorrect. And so
all right, I'm going to bring you
lying to.
I'm going to bring Dan in, and then I'll let others respond. Let me just read what the Ukraine foreign minister just said. The Ukrainian people and their President Zelensky refuse to give in to Putin's pressure. Nobody can force Ukraine to give up. We will defend our right to exist. Dan.
That's from the foreign minister. Do you guys really believe the foreign minister went around and asked every Ukrainian if they want to continue doing this? I highly doubt it. It's just like when Joe Biden made a statement and said that the U.S. will always continue to support Israel unequivocally. What did I tell you back then? I said, what do you mean? I never said that. A lot of you didn't say that, but Joe Biden made the statement and said basically like he was saying it for all Americans. So think about that as well with the foreign minister. So this is like Pierce knows better than that.
Yeah, that seems like pretty consistent with what they've been saying. Look, I mean, I'll agree with Glenn on one thing. Look, if you without Western support, yes, Russia would eventually beat Ukraine. Now, I think people forget the geopolitical strategies of this. For America, even for Europeans, this isn't so much about Ukraine. It's about Russia. And yes, I'd hate to break it to you, but it's not a contradiction to say that they are a second-rate power, but they would also invade Baltic states. That has long been part of Putin's grander plan for greater Russia. And they can do it if Europe and the United States lets them. Yes, they can do it to a small state if they let them.
don't you guys think if Russia wanted to take over, because they always go with Poland, if Russia wanted to invade Poland and take over Poland, don't you think they would have done that by now? Always question what is presented in front of you. As powerful as Russia is, don't you think they would have already done that? We're supposed to sit here and pretend that 2014 didn't happen. We're supposed to pretend that NATO didn't push this. Let's go back and check some things seriously, because the reality is we wouldn't even be in this situation right now if it wasn't for NATO going against the agreement that was made after the fall of the Berlin Wall, which is that they would not push, NATO would not expand towards Russia. NATO decides to expand towards Russia anyway, going against the agreement. Russia didn't go against that agreement. NATO did, and the US government went right along with it. So they're in on that together. There's one more part here. I'm gonna let this part play, and then we got to get to the difference between, Gaza and.
This is kind of how World War II happened. If I may remind everyone, there is a domino effect here. And there is grander purpose by Putin, and he said you just have to listen to what he says. You don't have to take my word for it, to expand their sphere. They can say that they feel under threat by NATO. They're full of crap. We know for a fact they've never felt threatened by NATO, only to the extent that they don't like NATO because it means they can't conquer other countries and take their stuff. Now, here's the biggest important part about geostrategic implications for the United States.
That part's hilarious, considering the US government conquers other countries and controls their stuff.
This is why it's about Russia, not Ukraine. When you allow dictators to just conquer other countries and take their stuff, you have reverted us to a pre-World War II history. That's problematic. That was a time in history, and it lasted for thousands of years, when we didn't have a global economy. Life sucked. There was tens of millions dead in wars because it was normalized for dictators to invade others if they wanted to take their stuff. And for the last 80 years, America has led an order where we don't allow that. That's actually
right, because we do it, because America does it, because America is the one that invades all these countries and takes their stuff. Let's fast forward here to the part about the difference between this situation of Gaza and Ukraine. This part right about here. You guys need to hear this part, because this is where I think, this is the part where I think they try to trip up Glenn.
The Ukrainians have the right to fight all they want. The question is whether or not the United States is duty bound, and whether American workers are duty bound.
Hold on. I'm just making sure I'm getting. Okay, I was just making sure I'm at the right spot. Sorry about that, guys. Right about there.
Probably because I'm a Kremlin agent. Probably because I'm a paid agent of the Kremlin, which is what you're implying. The reason I think the Ukrainians have the right to fight for as long. The reason the Ukrainians have the right to fight all they want. The question is whether or not the United States is duty bound, and whether American workers are duty bound to finance that war. And Americans made very clear in this election,
but Glenn, just to jump in
as well, that they don't want to.
Just to jump in, Glenn, on that point though about your apparent inconsistency, what is the difference in your head between the situation in Gaza and the situation in Ukraine?
This is a trick. This is a trick, right? So I'm going to let Glenn answer this. And then there's a portion to this that I want to answer, because I've seen people do what Pierce just did. Watch this.
I think the Palestinians have the right to resist the occupation. I think the Ukrainians have the right to fight the Russians as well. I don't have any inconsistencies at all. I'm not advocating that the United States arm the people of Gaza to fight against the Israeli occupation, just like I'm not advocating that the United States arm the people of Ukraine.
So should Israel be allowed to keep land in Gaza then?
No, but they're going to, because it's the reality. Even though I don't like it, it's the reality that the Israelis are vastly stronger.
So my point is, what is the difference? If you think that they should not be allowed to keep land in Gaza, having attacked it, but you think that Russia, I'm not to put words in your mouth, but do you think that Russia should be allowed to keep the land they've taken to go with the land they took in Crimea? I mean, do you think they should be allowed to?
No, I don't think it's right But I recognize the reality that the Israeli Jews are not going anywhere. They're going to stay in Israel. They're going to end up annexing the West Bank. Miriam Adelson paid for that to make sure. And they're going to continue to do whatever they want in Gaza and Syria and Lebanon, occupying the parts of those countries they're occupying. That's just the reality, even though I don't think they should. The reality is that Russia is a much stronger country than Ukraine and is going to end up protecting the ethnic Russian population in Crimea and eastern Ukraine, whether we like it or not. And this is something the U.S. government has known for many years. As I just referenced, that Bill Burns memo and a lot of other documents that ended up emerging showed that the U.S. government knew that.
The problem with Glenn, it's not so much that he's inconsistent. I think he fundamentally disagrees or doesn't understand what I laid out about the geopolitics of the last 80 years. That's one problem. Second.
Okay, we got enough of Dan. So I want to add this part. One part I wish Glenn would have added to this, because see, this is a trick question, and I've seen Pierce do this before, which is the fact that they try to say, well, if you support, the Palestinians' right to resist, then why don't you support the Ukrainian people's right to resist? So a couple of things. What Glenn is advocating for is that the U.S. government should have nothing to do with it, that the U.S. government should not fund Ukraine, and the U.S. government shouldn't fund Israel in these conflicts either. So he is being consistent with that. However, the point that I would have added to this is that you do have to remember that Ukraine was ethnically cleansing Russian Ukrainians. See, this is the part that, again, like Pierce and people, they want to leave this out. If you were to listen to corporate media, and especially anyone who's, wants you to see Russia as just an enemy and only an enemy, right? And this is not to say that Russia is perfect, because they're not. There's no such thing as a perfect country. They leave that part out because they want you to believe that this all started on, when Russia invaded Ukraine. Didn't you hear that similar rhetoric again? This all started on October 7th, and they totally bypassed everything that happened before that. They bypassed the Minsk Accords. They bypassed the 2014 coup with NATO. They bypassed that. They bypassed what I just told you about Ukraine that was ethnically cleansing Russian Ukrainians. Don't forget, they were committing war crimes against the children as well. All this is left out of the context. And so they just drive you with that day that they say Russia invaded. And so this is all Russia's fault. It is very important that you understand that context. And I had to obviously do a lot of research about this, but I've spoken to so many different people about Russia and Ukraine. And they've come onto this show, as you guys have seen, and they all give a little bit more information than what you're hearing on corporate media. And Scott Ritter, for example, goes through the whole history of it, right? So there's a reason why a lot of people sat down to watch that interview with Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin, because people wanted to hear the other side. And if you are watching corporate media, particularly here in the West, you're only hearing one side. All of these commentators and these so-called reporters, they're interviewing Zelensky. They're not interviewing Vladimir Putin. Do you think that's fair that people only get one side of the story with a war? You see the same thing with Israel and Gaza. All of these reporters that sat down to interview Benjamin Netanyahu or his advisors or IDF soldiers, you didn't see them sitting down and interviewing Hamas or people in Gaza at that point in time. No, CNN just all of a suddenly cares about the Palestinian people after Donald Trump won. Now they want to know how Palestinian Americans feel. They didn't care about how they felt before. The media is the gatekeeper. It is the gatekeeper of information, is the gatekeeper of the source of information. The media, corporate media, will have you so propagandized, especially if you're watching Western media. And most people don't have time to look up more information. And I'll give you an example, because Glenn tweeted this, right? So he showed receipts. Obviously, you can't do this when you're on Piers Morgan's show, but he said, I was on Piers Morgan's show earlier debating Ukraine when I said Ukraine's front line was crumbling and Russia was advancing westward. Dan Crenshaw said I made that up, which is odd since that's the consensus of even the most fanatically pro-Ukraine Western media. And he has receipts. Amid talk of ceasefire, Ukraine's front line is crumbling. Here's another one. Russian advances in Ukraine grew 7-fold in 2024. Data shows. Here's another one. Ukraine front could collapse as Russia gains accelerate. Experts warn. Another one. Their human resources are unlimited. Russia's advances signal bleak spring for Ukrainians. So what Glenn said was true. And obviously, when you're on Piers Morgan's show, you can't bring up these receipts the way that you can on your own show, right? But he was correct. And Dan Crenshaw was lying. But I think what Piers Morgan tries to do there, especially towards like the part of the conversation when he's like, well, would you feel that you feel one way about Gaza? Why don't you feel this way about Ukraine? Like that type of thing. It reminds me back when Piers Morgan was asking people, but do you condemn Hamas? It is to get you to shift gears and shift focus, right? It's a trick. And that's what I call it. It's a trick. And I think even though there was that trick, I think what Glenn was trying to say is that the U.S. should not be involved in either one of those conflicts. But the way that you hit back at that question, you also got to remember to tell people that NATO was not supposed to expand towards Russia after the fall of the Berlin Wall. That was the agreement. You have to remind people about the coup in 2014, about the Minsk Accords. And you also have to remind people that Ukraine, they were ethnically cleansing Russian Ukrainians. That is important to bring up. Again, when people are in these like heated discussions, I think a lot of times may not remember everything off the top of your head like that. But yes, thank you, Rogent, a red herring. Yeah, they throw you like this bone to try to like have a gotcha a moment, right? And so we just have to make sure that it's not the same. People have to understand Gaza and Ukraine is not the same thing. So, but I do think in the end, that's an interesting conversation. You guys got to watch the full debate. But I do think in the end, I think Glenn was the winner because that Dan Crenshaw dude is crazy. And obviously, as you can see with the data, he was wrong and Glenn was right. Hey guys, this was a Sabby clip. If you like what you saw, hit that like button and subscribe.